Before a Roman commander moved a very large army, he had to solve a problem that could not be settled on the battlefield. Daily survival depended on food for the men, fodder for the animals, and reliable access to water. A force of 100,000 soldiers was not a routine Roman field army. Ancient writers also tend to exaggerate numbers. Still, using that figure as a planning exercise reveals the scale of the system required to keep several legions and their supporting troops in operation. The first calculation concerns grain. Evidence from ancient texts and modern scholarship suggests that an infantryman might receive roughly 4 modii of wheat per month, equivalent to about 27 kilograms. That comes to approximately 900 grams a day. The exact ration varied by period, unit, and circumstance, but this is a reasonable working figure. For 100,000 soldiers, the daily requirement would be about 90 metric tons of grain. Over 30 days, the army would consume around 2,700 tons. This estimate covers only the soldiers' basic grain ration. It does not include officers' households, enslaved servants, mule drivers, engineers, merchants, medical personnel, or other civilians attached to the column. It also excludes wine, oil, salt, legumes, cheese, meat, and animal fodder. Once those demands are added, the amount moving toward the army becomes substantially larger. Grain formed the core of the ration because it was dense, durable, and relatively easy to measure. Roman soldiers did eat meat, and archaeological evidence shows that military diets could be varied. The popular image of the legionary surviving almost entirely on bread is too simple. Wheat and barley remained essential because they could be stored longer than fresh food and issued in standard quantities. The grain was often distributed whole rather than as finished bread. Each small tent group could grind part of its ration with a hand mill, mix the flour with water, and prepare porridge or a simple loaf. This transferred much of the final processing to the soldiers. It also allowed the army to carry grain in a form that generally kept better than flour. The method required time at the end of a march, so food preparation was built into the daily routine of camp construction. Roman soldiers normally lived and worked in small groups. In the imperial army, the basic tent group was the contubernium, usually composed of 8 men. The group shared a leather tent and commonly had a mule for heavier communal equipment. In a simplified army made entirely of such infantry groups, 100,000 men would form 12,500 contubernia. That would imply a similar order of magnitude in pack animals, before adding cavalry mounts, spare animals, artillery teams, and the animals belonging to officers or contractors. Those animals solved one problem while creating another. They could carry tents, tools, mills, baggage, and some food, but they also consumed resources every day. Fresh grass might be available in a well-watered region during the right season. In dry country, winter conditions, or an area already stripped by previous armies, fodder had to be gathered or transported. A route that appeared suitable for men could become unusable if it offered too little grazing for thousands of animals. Water created an even stricter limit, at only 10 liters per saldia per Dalton Y. 100,000 men would require 1 million liters. That amount weighs roughly 1,000 metric tons. Hot weather and heavy labor could raise the requirement, while animals would add a further burden. No practical train of carts and mules could carry the full daily water supply for such a force over a long distance. The army therefore had to move between rivers, springs, wells, cisterns, or previously prepared water points. Scouts and engineers needed to confirm that a source was accessible and large enough before the main column arrived. Preparation could begin during the previous agricultural season. Officials and contractors needed estimates of the harvest available in friendly territory. They also had to reserve ships, carts, drivers, and storage space. Buying too late could raise prices and leave insufficient time to move grain forward. Collecting too aggressively could damage the province expected to support the army in later years. Roman commanders therefore depended on cooperation from civilian administrations, local elites, tax collectors, and private carriers. The balance between purchase and compulsion varied according to political conditions. This explains why Roman logistics began long before the march. A commander first needed an operational base. The strongest bases were often located near a seaport, a navigable river, or a major road junction. Grain could be collected there from taxes, purchases, allied contributions, compulsory requisitions, or supplies gathered in Roman territory. The legal and administrative details changed over the centuries, but the principle remained stable. Food had to be assembled in advance and placed where transport could reach it. Roman military writers explicitly advised commanders to calculate requirements and gather provisions before opening a campaign. Bulk cargo usually moved most efficiently by sea or river. Ships and barges could carry far more grain than pack animals, and they did not consume part of the cargo as fodder. Roads were still important because they connected farms, towns, forts, river landings, and the army itself. Yet roads were often the final part of the supply chain rather than its entire length. A major campaign near the Rhine, Danube, Nile, or Mediterranean coast could draw upon water transport for much of the journey, then transfer supplies to carts and animals for the last stage. Transfer points were especially vulnerable. Grain arriving by ship might have to be unloaded, checked, stored, and repacked for inland movement. A shortage of labor at a port could delay an entire sequence of convoys even when the ships had arrived safely. Sacks, carts, harness, and draft teams all had to be available at the same time. The Romans could organize these operations on a large scale, but coordination depended on local capacity. A small river landing could not serve an enormous army merely because it appeared close on a map. A large campaign could use several layers of supply. Grain moved from producing districts to regional collection points. It then traveled to a protected base, usually in bulk. Smaller depots closer to the army reduced the distance that local convoys had to cover. From the forward depot, wagons or pack animals delivered supplies to the field force. Each stage required protection, handling, record-keeping, and a workable schedule. Roman military granaries were designed for storage rather than display. Many were raised above the ground on posts or low walls. Air could circulate beneath the floor, while the stored grain was better protected from damp and rodents. At a permanent fort, these buildings could hold substantial reserves. For an army of 100,000, however, a single granary would not be enough. The system would require a network of magazines and repeated deliveries. The commander also had to decide how many days of food the soldiers would carry. Josephus, describing the Roman army in the 1st century, states that infantrymen marched with provisions for 3 days along with tools and weapons. If each soldier carried roughly 3 days of grain, the men themselves could transport about 270 tons. This gave the army a short reserve and reduced immediate pressure on the baggage train. It did not permit independent movement for weeks. The 3-day reserve also shows why the marching schedule had to connect one supply opportunity to the next. A delay at a river crossing, a damaged bridge, or an enemy raid could consume the margin quickly. Commanders therefore avoided moving the entire force as one undifferentiated mass. The column could be divided into marching groups, each with an assigned place, baggage, and guard. The exact order changed according to the threat and terrain. At the end of the day, the Romans normally built a camp. The camp protected the soldiers, but it also organized distribution. Units occupied known positions. Baggage and animals could be placed in controlled areas. Grain could be issued to designated groups without requiring the whole army to crowd around one wagon park. The regular arrangement helped officers identify shortages and keep traffic moving through the gates. Distribution continued below the level of the depot. Supplies passed through the legion, cohort, century, and tent group, according to the organization of the force. The exact procedure was not identical in every army or century, and surviving evidence is incomplete. Standard measures and written tallies nevertheless helped prevent confusion. Most soldiers did not approach the main warehouse individually. Their ration moved through the unit structure, which kept the process manageable and made officers responsible for shortages within their commands. Administration was necessary, because a small error became enormous when multiplied by 100,000. Cutting only 100 grams from each man's issue would remove 10 tons from the daily ration. An incorrect animal count could leave a convoy without enough fodder, while a mistaken delivery date might send 2 columns to one depot and leave another depot unused. Roman records from forts and military communities show careful accounting for food, pay, equipment, animals, and transport. The army did not possess a single logistics service identical to a modern institution. Responsibility was divided among commanders, camp officers, financial officials, clerks, contractors, local authorities, and soldiers assigned to specific duties. Their arrangements were not always efficient, and corruption remained possible. Even so, written accounts allowed commanders to estimate how long existing stocks would last. Surviving tablets from Vindolanda include accounts of foodstuffs and correspondence concerning the purchase of thousands of modii of grain. Civilian traders often followed Roman armies or gathered around permanent forts. They sold prepared food, wine, clothing, tools, and other goods that were not always included in the official ration. Soldiers could use their pay to improve an otherwise basic diet. These markets reduced pressure on military stores when commerce was functioning, although they could not feed the full army during a blockade or deep advance into hostile territory. Merchants also required protection and transport, so their presence formed another part of the wider campaign economy. The surrounding countryside provided another source of supply. An army could buy food from merchants, demand contributions from allied communities, requisition supplies under official authority, or seize them in hostile territory. Caesar's campaigns repeatedly show that obtaining grain affected routes and timing. On one occasion, he turned toward Bibracte because only 2 days remained before the next grain issue. The enemy recognized the movement and attacked his column. Foraging was useful, but it could not support an army of 100,000 indefinitely. The force needed a very large agricultural zone, and the useful radius around the camp was limited by daylight, terrain, and enemy action. Soldiers sent to collect grain or livestock were temporarily unavailable for battle, camp work, and engineering. They also became vulnerable when dispersed across fields and villages. Roman forces used foraging, requisition, allied support, and deliveries from established supply systems according to local circumstances. A region might contain enough food in total, but still fail to feed the army quickly enough. Grain could be hidden, stored in scattered settlements, or still standing in the fields. Mills might be absent or damaged. Local roads could become impassable after rain. Farmers could drive away livestock before Roman troops arrived. The logistical question was not simply whether food existed. It had to reach the soldiers before the army exhausted its reserve. Hostile commanders understood this weakness. Crops and mills could be destroyed, livestock removed, roads blocked, and access to wells denied. Convoys were vulnerable to raids when terrain forced them through narrow or exposed routes. Such measures also harmed the local population, sometimes severely. A scorched earth defense could deny supplies to the invader, but it reduced the defender's own ability to remain in the region. The decision therefore depended on political control and the willingness to sacrifice local resources. Season affected every part of the system. Grain became easier to obtain after harvest. Grass and water changed with rainfall. Rivers could flood or become too shallow. Mediterranean sailing was more hazardous during winter, and many commanders reduced major operations when transport became unreliable. Winter quarters allowed troops to remain near prepared stores and shelter, though garrisons still needed a continuing supply. A campaign plan therefore had a logistical limit. A port or river base allowed the commander to concentrate forces for a longer period. Movement inland increased the burden on carts and pack animals with each additional day. More transport animals required more fodder, which demanded additional transport or local grazing. Eventually, adding vehicles and animals stopped extending the army's reach, because the transport system consumed too much of what it carried. This was one reason a force of 100,000 was difficult to keep together. Splitting it into several columns reduced congestion and allowed each group to draw from a wider area. Separate columns could use different roads and water sources, then concentrate for a battle or siege. The method created military risks because an enemy might attack one part before the others arrived. Logistics and tactics could not be planned independently. Sieges placed special pressure on supply. A besieging army remained in one area, so nearby food and fodder disappeared quickly. The soldiers also needed timber, stone, iron, replacement tools, and material for siege works. If the defenders had prepared large stores, the attackers might consume more food than the city before any breach was made. A Roman commander could not assume that time automatically favored him. If deliveries failed, the first response was usually to reduce consumption, seek local supplies, or alter the route. A ration cut damaged strength and morale. Commanders might slaughter transport animals for a brief supply of meat. Although the loss reduced future mobility, heavy equipment could be abandoned to ease movement, at the cost of weaker camps and fewer options during a siege. Relief in the present often produced a more serious shortage later. Disease often followed prolonged shortage. Malnourished soldiers were less able to march, dig, guard, and fight. Camp sanitation could deteriorate when men were exhausted or when clean water was scarce. Large concentrations of people and animals produced waste that had to be managed every day. The Roman habit of building ordered camps and assigning routine labor helped, but no layout could compensate for contaminated water or a collapsed food supply. To feed 100,000 soldiers, Rome therefore needed more than a long line of wagons. Grain requirements had to be estimated months before the campaign. Provincial administrations and allied communities needed time to assemble supplies. Ports, river craft, granaries, roads, animals, handlers, depots, guards, and records all formed part of the operation. Local purchase and foraging could supplement that structure, but they could not reliably replace it at this scale. The daily calculation remained unforgiving. Roughly 90 tons of grain had to reach the soldiers. Water had to be found locally in quantities measured in hundreds of tons. Thousands of animals had to be fed and kept healthy. The reserve carried by the men might cover only a few days. A single lost convoy would not always destroy the army, but repeated delays could force it to stop, divide, retreat, or fight before conditions were favorable. Roman military success did not come from a flawless system. Campaigns stalled, soldiers went hungry, convoys were captured, and commanders made serious mistakes. Rome's advantage was its repeated ability to mobilize resources from towns, provinces, merchants, allies, military bases, and transport networks. That capacity allowed large forces to remain in the field longer than many opponents could manage. An army of 100,000 could be assembled by order. Keeping it alive required continuous work across a much larger area than the camp itself. Every day of operations drew upon agricultural surpluses, collected by officials and moved by transport workers. Guards protected the cargo, while clerks tracked its destination. A functioning connection between these people kept the army mobile. A serious break in the system could turn its great size into a liability.